I can still hear the wind whistling through the canvas. It wasn't the sound of a war machine, not like the heavy thrum of the B-17s or the high-pitched scream of the Mustangs. It was a thin, fragile sound, like a kite caught in a gale. People don't realize that those L4 grasshoppers were basically just tubes of steel and stretched fabric. You could stick a pencil through the side of the cockpit if you pressed hard enough. It felt like flying a toy, a motorized dragonfly in a world of lead and steel. I remember standing on that muddy field in late '44, looking at the struts of my plane and feeling the eyes of the infantry boys on me. They were covered in the gray-brown grime of the French winter, clutching their garans like they were the only things keeping them grounded to the earth. They looked at my little plane and they laughed. One big corporal, a man with a jaw like a cinder block, spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the slush and pointed a calloused finger at the wings. He asked me if I'd bought it at a five-and-dime store or if I'd built it out of balsa wood in my mother's kitchen. He called it a toy plane, a paper coffin, and a suicide kite. He and his buddies, they were the ones with the bazookas slung over their shoulders, the heavy anti-tank weapons that were supposed to be the only thing standing between them and the German Panthers. They mocked me for being up there with nothing but a map and a radio. They didn't know what I was planning. They didn't know that by the end of the week, those same men would be looking at the sky like it was the only thing that could save their souls. The guilt is what stays with you, though. Not the fear, but the knowing. I'm 92 years old now, sitting in a chair that's far too comfortable for a man who's seen the things I've seen. I look at my hands. They're thin now, the skin like parchment paper, spotted with age. And I remember how they used to tremble when I'd prime the engine in the pre-dawn cold. The air in France that winter was like breathing needles. It got deep into your lungs and stayed there. We were stationed near the edge of a decimated forest, the trees nothing but black splintered fingers reaching for a gray sky. The ground was a soup of frozen mud and shattered stone. Every time a shell went off in the distance, you could feel the vibration in the soles of your boots. It was a constant low-level dread. And there I was, climbing into a cockpit that didn't even have a heater. I'd wrap myself in layers of wool and leather, feeling like a stuffed doll, barely able to move my arms. The infantry guys would huddle around their little fires, watching me with that mixture of pity and derision. They thought I was a scout, someone who just flew over the lines to see where the Germans were hiding, so the real soldiers could do the fighting. They had no idea that I'd been tinkering with that toy plane late into the night, working with a mechanic who was just as crazy as I was. We'd found a way to strap 3 M1 bazookas to the wing struts on each side. It was a jury-rigged, terrifying piece of engineering. We used wire and tape and sheer desperation. To the boys on the ground, it looked ridiculous. It looked like a child's game. They joked that I was going to go up there and pop some balloons. I remember the morning the fog finally lifted. It had been sitting over us for days, a thick, wet blanket that kept the heavy bombers grounded and the panzers hidden. But that morning, the air cleared just enough. You could see the valley stretching out toward the German lines, and that's when we heard it. It's a sound you never forget. It isn't a rumble, it's a grinding, metallic shriek, the sound of heavy treads chewing through frozen earth. The Panthers were coming, 7 of them emerging from the tree line like prehistoric monsters. They were beautiful in a terrible way. Sleek, sloped armor, long-barreled guns that could punch through anything we had at 1,000 yards. The infantry boys stopped laughing. I saw that corporal, the one who'd mocked me, scrambling into a shallow foxhole, clutching his bazooka with white knuckles. He looked small. We all looked small. The power of those machines was overwhelming. They didn't just move. They claimed the ground they stood on. And my little grasshopper was sitting there on the grass, looking like a piece of laundry that had blown away. I remember the smell of the fuel as I climbed in. It was sharp and sweet. I didn't feel brave. I felt exposed. I felt like a man walking into a thunderstorm with a paper umbrella. But I had to get up there. If those tanks broke through, the whole line would collapse. There was nobody else. The takeoff was a nightmare. The ground was so soft that the wheels kept sinking, and I thought for sure I'd flip the plane nose first into the mud. I pushed the throttle forward, the little engine screaming its heart out, and I felt the tail lift. It was like the earth didn't want to let go. When I finally broke free of the gravity, I felt a sudden, terrifying lightness. Below me, the world fell away. I could see the foxholes, the tiny figures of our men, and the massive dark shapes of the Panther tanks. They were spitting fire now, the flashes of their cannons like angry orange eyes. I could see the smoke rising from the American positions. We were getting hammered. The toy plane was bouncing in the turbulent air, the fabric of the wings vibrating so hard I thought the bazookas would just tear right off. I was flying at maybe 800 feet, low enough to see the individual rivets on the German armor if I looked close enough. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wasn't thinking about medals. I wasn't thinking about the system or the matrix or the grand sweep of history. I was thinking about the fact that if a single rifleman on the ground decided to lead his shot, I'd be a fireball before I could even scream. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I circled wide, trying to use the glare of the morning sun to hide my approach. It's a funny thing about being in the air. You feel like a god and a target all at once. I could see the Germans hadn't even noticed me yet. Why would they? They were focused on the infantry, on the real threats. They probably thought I was just some lost observer, some harmless bird in the sky. I came in low, hugging the contour of a ridge, my hands sweating inside my gloves. The controls felt sluggish with the weight of the bazookas. I had to time it perfectly. These weren't guided missiles. These were aim and pray weapons. I had to dive, line up the struts with the rear deck of the lead tank, and pull the trigger wires I'd rigged through the cabin window. The first Panther was sitting there, stationary, its turret slowly turning to crush a farmhouse where some of our boys were holed up. I could see the black cross on the side of the hull. I gripped the stick, took a breath that tasted like oil and fear, and pushed the nose down. The wind screamed through the struts. I was doing maybe 90 miles an hour, which felt like warp speed in that little kite. I lined it up. I waited until the tank filled my field of vision until I could see the heat haze shimmering off its engine exhaust. I pulled the first wire. The whole plane bucked. It was like someone had kicked the wing with a giant boot. The rocket whooshed out, a trail of white smoke and fire, and for a second I thought I'd missed. But then the back of the Panther erupted. A gout of orange flame shot 20 feet into the air. The engine had been hit directly. The tank didn't explode right away, it just stopped. It breathed out a thick, oily black smoke that started to veil the battlefield. I pulled up hard, my stomach dropping into my boots, and I looked down. The German crew was scrambling out of the hatches, their clothes on fire. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I felt a cold, hard clarity. It worked. The toy worked, but I wasn't done. There were 6 more of them, and they were starting to realize that the threat wasn't coming from the ground. They were starting to turn their machine guns toward the sky. I could see the tracers now, those glowing red lines reaching out for me like the fingers of a ghost. They look slow from a distance, but when they're passing a few feet from your wing, they're the fastest things in the world. They make a sound like zip, 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 a tearing noise that tells you death is just a fraction of an inch away. I remember thinking about my father back in Ohio. He'd been a carpenter. He used to say that every tool has a purpose, and if you use the wrong tool for the job, you're going to get hurt. I wondered what he'd think of me then, using a scout plane as a dive bomber. It was the ultimate wrong tool. But out there, in the chaos of the Ardennes, the rules didn't apply. The only rule was survival. I banked the plane so hard the wings groaned, looking for the second target. The Panthers had scattered a bit, realizing they were being hunted from above. One of them was trying to back into the shadow of a stone wall. I dived again. This time, the tracers were thicker. I could feel the impact of small arms fire hitting the fabric of the fuselage. It sounded like hail on a tin roof. "Don't stall," I whispered to the engine. "Don't you dare stall." I lined up the second tank, a big beast that was firing its whole MG into the tree line. I pulled the second wire, another hit. This one caught the turret ring. The explosion was louder this time, a sharp crack that echoed through the valley. The tank's ammunition must have cooked off because the turret actually lifted an inch before settling back down, crooked and useless. 2 down. The adrenaline is a liar. It makes you think you're invincible right up until the moment you break. I was laughing, a high, thin sound that I didn't recognize as my own. I was the boy they'd mocked. I was the pilot of the paper coffin, and I was raining hell on the most feared machines on the planet. I circled back, the wind whipping through the holes in my wings. I had 4 rockets left. The Germans were panicked now. They weren't used to this. They were used to air superiority, or at the very least, being ignored by the little guys. I saw the third tank trying to cross a small bridge. If I could take him there, I'd block the path for the rest. I pushed the grasshopper into a steep bank, feeling the G-force pulling at my face. I could see the infantry boys now. They were standing up in their foxholes, watching. They weren't firing. They were just staring at the sky. I think they were as shocked as the Germans were. I came in on the third tank from the side. It was a risky shot. I had to lead him just right. I pulled the wire, and the rocket streaked across the field, slamming into the drive sprocket. The track flew off like a giant broken rubber band, and the tank spun uselessly, wedging itself across the mouth of the bridge. 3. I'm sitting here now, in the silence of my living room, and I can still feel the vibration of that stick in my hand. It never really goes away. People talk about the greatest generation and all that, but we were just kids who were handed a world on fire and told to put it out with whatever we had. Sometimes all we had was a toy plane and a little bit of madness. I look at the photos of my friends who didn't come back, and I wonder why I was the one who got to grow old. Why did I get to see the moon landing and the internet and the birth of my great-grandchildren while they stayed 20 years old forever in the soil of France? There's no logic to it. It's just the way the dice fell. But that day, in that sky, I felt like I was holding the dice. I felt like I was finally doing something that mattered, something that would stop the matrix of that war from grinding up more of my friends. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The 4th and 5th tanks were caught in a bottleneck now, behind the one I'd crippled on the bridge. They were sitting ducks, but they were angry. Their anti-aircraft fire was getting more accurate. I felt a sharp jar as a piece of shrapnel sliced through the floorboards, missing my boot by an inch. The cockpit filled with the smell of scorched metal and raw gasoline. I knew I was leaking fuel. I had to finish this fast, or I was going to become a torch. I didn't have time for fancy maneuvers. I just leveled out and flew straight at them, one after the other. It was a suicide run, really. If they'd had a decent gunner on those machine guns, they would have shredded me. But I think the sheer audacity of what I was doing froze them for a second. I fired the 4th rocket, a direct hit on the engine deck of the 4th tank. It flared up instantly. The 5th tank tried to push the burning wreck out of the way, its engine roaring, black smoke pouring from its exhausts. I didn't even circle. I just banked, kicked the rudder, and lined up for the final shot on that one. I pulled the 5th wire. The rocket skipped off the top of the turret and exploded against the rear hull. It wasn't a clean kill, but it started a fire that the crew couldn't put out. They bailed. 5 tanks. In a plane that cost less than a luxury car back home. I was out of rockets on the left wing, and I had one left on the right. The plane was flying heavy on one side, lurching through the air. The engine was starting to cough, the fuel pressure gauge flickering into the red. I should have headed back. I had done more than enough. But there were 2 more Panthers left, and they were turning their guns toward the infantry again. They were frustrated, looking for something to kill. I couldn't leave those boys down there. I remember seeing a young private, couldn't have been more than 18, crouching behind a stone wall. He looked up at me, and even from that height, I could see the terror in his eyes. He wasn't looking at a hero. He was looking at a witness. I couldn't let him die while I had 1 shot left. I climbed, struggling to get some altitude. The grasshopper was wheezing. I reached 2,000 feet, and the world seemed to go silent for a moment. The sound of the battle was muffled by the wind. I looked at the last 2 tanks. They were side by side now, firing into the woods. I realized I only had 1 rocket, but if I could hit the one on the left just right, maybe the explosion would take out the other, or at least disable it. It was a long shot, a 1,000,000-to-1 shot. I tipped the wing, feeling the stall warning buffet through the airframe. I went into a vertical dive. It's not something an L4 is meant to do. The wing started to flutter, a terrifying vibration that felt like the fabric was going to peel right off the ribs. I was staring straight down at the gray steel plates of those Panthers. They looked like turtles from up here. I waited. My eyes were watering from the wind coming through the broken glass. I waited until the very last second, until the ground was rushing up to swallow me. I pulled the last wire. The rocket didn't just hit the tank. It hit the auxiliary fuel drums they'd strapped to the back for the long march. The result was a fireball that was bigger than anything I'd seen the whole war. It was a wall of white heat that slammed into the 2nd tank like a physical blow. The 6th tank was gone instantly. The 7th didn't blow up, but the concussion and the heat were so intense that the crew just stopped. They opened the hatches and ran. They didn't even look back. I pulled up so hard that I blacked out for a second. Everything went gray, then black. When I came to, I was staring at the treetops, my heart hammering a rhythm I thought would burst my chest. I had done it. 7 tanks. I limped back toward our lines. The engine was missing cycles now, a rhythmic thump hiss that told me it was dying. I didn't have enough fuel to reach the airfield. I had to find a clearing, any patch of ground that wasn't covered in mines or craters. I saw a stretch of road, narrow and lined with those tall, skeletal French poplars. I lined it up, my hands feeling like lead. I remembered the landing. It wasn't a landing, it was a controlled crash. The wheels hit a frozen rut, the strut snapped, and the toy plane skidded along the ice on its belly, screaming as the metal ground against the road. I came to a stop in a ditch, the nose buried in a hedge. Silence. The most beautiful silence I'd ever heard. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I sat there for a long time, just breathing. The smell of the earth was so strong. It smelled like life. I climbed out of the wreckage, my legs shaking so badly I had to lean against the crumpled wing. I looked back toward the valley. The smoke from the 7 Panthers was rising in long black columns against the winter sky. It looked like a forest of shadow. And then I heard them, the infantry. They were coming down the road, running, shouting. I thought maybe they were chasing the Germans, but then I realized they were coming for me. That corporal, the one with the tobacco juice and the bazooka, he was leading them. He reached me first. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the plane, then at me, then back at the valley. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled pack of Luckies, and offered me one. His hands were shaking too. He lit it for me, the flame steady in the cold air. "I'll be damned," he said, his voice a low growl. The toy plane. He didn't mock me anymore. He stayed with me until the medics came, just sitting there in the ditch, smoking in silence. We didn't need to talk. We'd both seen the same thing. We'd seen the world change in 20 minutes. I never saw those men again after the war. That's the thing about combat. You form these bonds that are tighter than family, forged in the fire of shared extinction. And then the war ends and you just drift away. You go back to Ohio or New York or Georgia, and you try to forget the smell of the fuel and the sound of the tracers. You try to pretend that you're the same person who left, but you aren't. You're a ghost inhabiting a living man's body. I spent 40 years working in a hardware store, selling hammers and nails, and nobody knew. My neighbors didn't know. My kids didn't really know. To them, I was just Dad, the man who liked to garden and always kept his shoes polished. They didn't see the man who dived a kite at a line of panthers. They didn't see the fire. I think about the system a lot these days. This modern world we've built, with its screens and its noise and its constant frantic hurry. It feels like another kind of matrix, a way to keep us from looking at the things that actually matter. We spend our lives worrying about things that are as fragile as that canvas-covered plane, thinking they're solid steel. We mock the things that are small and quiet, and we worship the things that are loud and powerful. But that day taught me that the small things, the toys, are often the only things that can break the machine. It taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the realization that something else is more important than your own skin. I'm 92 years old, and I'm finally telling this because I'm the last one left. The mechanic who helped me rig those bazookas died in '82. The corporal, I found out later, passed away in a VA hospital in the '90s. The Panthers are all rusted out in museums or buried under the French soil. The war is a footnote in a history book for most people now. But for me, it's still that morning in December. It's still the smell of the Lucky Strike in the ditch. It's still the sight of those 7 black columns of smoke rising into the air. I'm telling you this because you need to know that even when the world mocks you, even when you feel like a toy in a world of giants, you have a role to play. You have a shot to take. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember the debriefing. It was surreal. A colonel with a chest full of ribbons looked at me like I was a specimen in a jar. He didn't know what to do with me. I'd technically violated a dozen regulations by modifying the aircraft and engaging the enemy without orders. But I'd also saved a battalion. They ended up giving me a medal, but they didn't want to talk about how I did it. It didn't fit the manual. The manual said L4s are for observation. The system doesn't like it when you color outside the lines, even if you're doing it to save the system from itself. I realized then that the army, the government, the whole structure of the war, it was just another machine. It didn't care about Henry Lawson. It cared about the unit and the objective. But those boys in the foxholes, they cared. They saw the man, not the rank. That's the only truth I ever found in the whole mess. I sometimes wonder about the German crews, the ones who bailed out. Did they go home? Did they have grandkids who sit on their laps and ask about the war? Do they remember the little green plane that came out of the sun like a vengeful bird? I don't hate them anymore. I haven't for a long time. They were just kids too, trapped in a different version of the same machine. We were all just fuel for the fire, but I hope they lived. I hope they saw that the things they were told were invincible. The Panthers, the Reich, the master race, were all just as fragile as my balsa wood wings. Everything breaks eventually. The only thing that lasts is the way we treated each other when the breaking was happening. People ask me if I'm proud. It's a hard word, proud. I'm glad I did it. I'm glad those boys lived to see another day. But there's a weight to it that pride doesn't cover. It's a heavy thing to carry. The knowledge of what you're capable of when you're pushed to the edge. It changes you. You can't go back to the 5 and dime store and look at a toy plane the same way. You can't look at a field of snow without seeing the black smoke. I've lived a long life, a good life, but a part of me never left that cockpit. A part of me is still up there, circling the valley, waiting for the fog to lift. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I think the reason I'm still here, at 92, is to bear witness to the absurdity of it all. To remind people that the things they think are important, the status, the mockery, the big bazookas, don't mean a damn thing when the Panthers are coming. What matters is the man next to you. What matters is the decision you make when you're terrified and alone. I'm not a hero. I was just a boy with a toy plane who got tired of watching his friends die. And maybe that's the only kind of hero there really is. Someone who just refuses to let the machine win. As the years go by, the memories don't fade. They just get sharper, like a photograph being developed in a darkroom. The edges become more defined. I can see the frost on the poplars. I can hear the specific clack of the bazooka being loaded. I can feel the cold metal of the cockpit door. It's all still there. I'm just waiting for the final landing now. The one where I don't have to worry about the fuel or the tracers. I hope, when I get there, I see that corporal again. I hope he's got another pack of Luckies. I think we'd have a lot to talk about now that the smoke has finally cleared. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The mechanics didn't know what to make of me when I walked back into the hangar. If you could call a tent made of oil-stained canvas and hope a hangar. They'd heard the radio chatter, of course. Everyone had. The airwaves had been thick with the frantic reports of the Bazooka Charlie, or whatever name they were starting to pin on me. I remember old Joe, a man who seemed like he was born with grease under his fingernails and a cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth, just standing there with a wrench in his hand. He looked at my L4, or what was left of it after that ditch landing. The wings were shredded, the struts were twisted like pretzels, and there was a hole in the fuselage big enough to put your head through. He didn't say, "Good job, Henry." He didn't ask if I was hurt. He just walked over to the wing, ran his hand along the empty bazooka tubes and whispered, "The damn thing actually held together." That was the highest praise you could get in the motor pool. It wasn't about glory, it was about the machine doing its job when the world was trying to tear it apart. That night was the first time I couldn't sleep because of the silence. Usually, the artillery was constant, a rhythmic thumping that acted like a dark heartbeat for the war. But that night, at least in our sector, it felt like the world was holding its breath. I lay there on my cot, staring up at the dark, and I could still feel the phantom vibration of the engine in my teeth. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the orange flare of the fuel drums on the back of that 7th Panther. I saw the way the tank commander's hatch flew open. I didn't see a monster. I saw a man who was probably just as cold and scared as I was, trapped in a different set of gears. That's the thing they don't tell you about being a hero. It doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like a debt you've incurred that you'll never be able to pay back. You've taken something that doesn't belong to you, the future of 7 crews, and you have to carry that weight around while everyone else is cheering. The brass came around the next day. They weren't smiling. They looked at my modified grasshopper like it was some kind of heresy. In their world, everything had a place. Scouts were for looking, tanks were for killing, and infantry was for dying. When you start mixing those things up, the people in the offices get nervous. They asked me who gave me permission to mount anti-tank weapons on a primary trainer. I told them the truth, that the Germans didn't ask for permission when they started shooting at my friends. They didn't like that answer. They wanted a paper trail. They wanted to know the doctrine I was following. It was the first time I really understood that the war wasn't just a fight between soldiers. It was a fight against the system itself, the matrix of bureaucracy that cares more about the rules than the results. They eventually let it go because they couldn't argue with 7 burned-out panzers. But they made sure I knew that I was an outlier, an anomaly. They didn't want a dozen Henry Lawsons flying kites with rockets. They wanted 1,000 obedient cogs who wouldn't question the manual. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The winter of '44 turned into a long gray blur of freezing rain and low-ceiling clouds. We moved deeper into the Ardennes, and the toy plane became my only home. I'd sleep in the cockpit sometimes, curled up in my flight suit, just to stay off the frozen ground. The smell of the plane, that mix of dope, gasoline, and old wool, became the only thing that felt real. Everything else was just a shifting landscape of ruins and ghosts. I remember flying over a village near the German border. It had no name that I could find on my map, or maybe the map was just old. From 500 feet up, it looked like a child had stepped on a model town. The church steeple was snapped off like a toothpick. There were no people, no animals, just the smoke from a few smoldering ruins. I felt a sudden sharp pang of loneliness. Not the kind you feel when you're away from home, but a cosmic kind of loneliness. Like I was the last soul left in a world that had decided to commit suicide. I was flying a routine patrol when I saw them, a column of refugees. They were moving west, away from the front. Old women pushing carts, children carrying bundles that were probably everything they owned in the world. They looked like ants from my perspective, a slow, agonizing line of misery. And then I saw the shadows. 2 Mi-109s were coming in low from the east. They weren't looking for me. They were looking for targets of opportunity. The German pilots were desperate by then, and desperation makes men do things they'd never do in their right minds. I knew what was going to happen before it did. They were going to strafe that column. I didn't have any bazookas that day. All I had was my sidearm and a radio. I could have turned away. I should have turned away. My engine was already coughing, and I was low on fuel. But I thought about that corporal and the tobacco juice. I thought about the toy plane. I didn't think. I just dived. I didn't have guns, but I had a presence. I came screaming down right between the refugees and the Messerschmitts, waving the wings of the L-4 like a madman. I wanted to distract them, to make them think I was bait for an ambush. Those pilots must have been as shocked as I was. Here was this little green dragonfly diving into their flight path without a single weapon. They banked away, startled, and for a second, I was flying right alongside one of them. I could see the pilot's face. He looked young, he looked tired. He looked at my plane, at my goggles, and for a heartbeat, we were just 2 human beings caught in a gale. He didn't fire. He just dipped his wing and peeled off, his wingman following him into the clouds. I don't know why he didn't kill me. I was a sitting duck. Maybe he was tired of the killing too. Maybe he saw the toy and decided that today, the machine didn't need another victim. I circled back over the refugees. They were all huddled in the ditches, waiting for the death that didn't come. As I flew over, a little boy in a tattered coat stood up and waved. Just a small, frantic motion of a hand. It was the most important thing I'd seen the whole war. It wasn't a tank exploding or a medal being pinned. It was a sign of life in a landscape of death. I didn't feel like a veteran then. I felt like a human being again. The weight of the 7 tanks felt a little lighter for a few minutes. I realized then that the war wasn't won by the big machines or the grand strategies. It was won in those tiny moments where someone decided not to be a monster. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. By the time we crossed into Germany, the mood had changed. It wasn't about liberation anymore. It was about the end. You could smell it in the air, the scent of a dying empire. It was the smell of wet brick dust, scorched timber, and something sweet and cloying that you didn't want to identify. The resistance was getting fiercer and more pathetic at the same time. We were seeing kids, 12 or 13 years old, wearing uniforms 3 sizes too big, clutching Panzerfausts with trembling hands. It made my stomach turn. I remember flying over a ridge and seeing a group of them huddled in a shell crater. They looked like they were waiting for their mothers to call them for dinner, not like they were fighting a world war. I couldn't bring myself to report their position. The system would have sent in the artillery and turned that crater into a grave. I just flew past, pretending I didn't see them. I wonder sometimes if they made it home. I hope they did. I hope they grew up to realize that the men who put them in those uniforms were the real enemies. The guilt of what I didn't do started to weigh as much as the guilt of what I did. That's the trap of the veteran's mind. You spend the rest of your life playing, what if? What if I'd stayed in Ohio? What if I hadn't rigged those bazookas? What if I'd fired on those kids? The matrix of memory doesn't let you off easy. It replays the scenes over and over, looking for a different ending. But the ending never changes. The tanks still burn. The boy still waves. The cold still seeps into your bones. I'm 92, and I still wake up some nights thinking I need to check the fuel pressure in the L4. I still feel the need to look for tracers in the dark corner of my bedroom. It's a permanent haunting. I remember one night near the end, we were stationed in a captured German manor house. It was a beautiful place, or it had been. Now the windows were gone, and the grand piano in the parlor was being used as a dining table for sea rations. I found a library in the back, filled with leather-bound books that smelled of ancient paper and wisdom. I couldn't read the German, but I held one of the books in my hands and felt a strange sense of grief. All this culture, all this history, and it couldn't stop the madness. It couldn't stop the Panthers. It couldn't stop us from turning their home into a barracks. We think we're so civilized, so advanced, but we're just one bad decade away from burning the library to keep the wind out. That's the truth the war teaches you. Civilization is a thin coat of paint on a very old, very dark wall. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The day the war ended, I didn't feel like celebrating. I was sitting on the wing of my plane, watching the sun set over a field in southern Germany. Someone brought over a bottle of something they'd liberated from a cellar, but I didn't want a drink. I just wanted the engine to stop echoing in my head. Everyone was shouting and firing their guns into the air, but all I could think about was the silence that was coming. The silence of the millions who wouldn't be going home. The silence of the towns that were gone. I looked at my L4, the toy plane that had carried me through the fire, and I felt a sudden urge to burn it, to erase the evidence of what I'd had to become to survive, but I didn't. I just sat there until the stars came out, feeling the cold air of a world that was suddenly, terrifyingly at peace. Coming home was the hardest part. They put us on a boat, thousands of us, packed like sardines. We were all staring at the horizon, looking for the Statue of Liberty, but I think most of us were looking for the people we used to be. I remember walking down the gangplank in New York. The noise was overwhelming. People were screaming, bands were playing, and there was confetti everywhere. It felt fake. It felt like a movie set. I wanted to tell them that the world they were celebrating didn't exist anymore. I wanted to tell them about the smell of the Ardennes and the look in that German pilot's eyes, but I didn't. I just smiled and hugged my mother, and I went back to Ohio. I buried the Bazooka Charlie deep inside me, under layers of hardware store invoices and Sunday morning church services. I built a life on top of the ruins, just like everyone else. But you can't bury the truth forever. It leaks out. It shows up in the way you flinch at a car backfiring. It shows up in the way you can't stand to waste food. It shows up in the way you look at your grandchildren and feel a sudden, sharp fear for their future. You see the same patterns repeating, the same matrix trying to convince another generation that glory is found in the barrel of a gun or the armor of a tank. I see the world today with all its shiny new toys and its digital wars, and I want to scream at them. I want to tell them that the only thing that's real is the person standing next to you. The rest is just fabric and balsa wood, waiting to be set on fire. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I'm 92 now, and my time is short. I know that. I can feel the engine missing cycles again, but I'm not afraid of the landing this time. I've done my flight. I've taken my shots. I'm telling you this not because I want you to think I'm a hero, but because I want you to understand the cost. I want you to see the man behind the toy plane. We are all flying fragile things through a world that wants to shoot us down. We are all modified for a mission we didn't choose. The trick is to remember that you're the pilot, not the plane. You're the one who decides when to dive and when to wave. You're the only thing in this whole mess that actually matters. I think about that corporal sometimes. I hope he found his peace. I hope he lived a life where he didn't have to carry a bazooka ever again. And I hope somewhere out there that little boy who waved at me is sitting in a chair just like this one, telling his own story to his own grandkids. Because if he's there, then the toy plane did its job. It didn't just kill tanks, it saved a future. And maybe in the end, that's enough. That's more than enough for a kid from Ohio who just wanted to fly. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. You know, the thing they never tell you in the history books is how much of the war was just waiting. Waiting for the fuel to arrive, waiting for the fog to lift, waiting for orders that usually didn't make any sense once they reached the front. I spent a lot of those waiting hours just sitting on the tire of my L4, looking at the horizon. People think of pilots as being removed from the mud, but in a grasshopper, you lived in it. My boots were never dry. My hands were always stained with a mixture of engine oil and the red clay of the French countryside. It was a strange existence, being both an aviator and a grunt. I'd be up in the clouds 1 hour, feeling like I was above the reach of man, and the next, I'd be digging a trench because a stray mortar round decided to land near our makeshift strip. That contrast, that constant shifting between the sublime and the miserable, it does something to your head. It makes you realize that the world is a very thin place. There's not much separating the guy drinking coffee from the guy who isn't coming home. I remember a specific afternoon in January of '45. The snow was so thick it looked like the world had been erased. I was sent up to spot for a heavy artillery battery that was trying to knock out a hidden German railgun. The railgun was a monster, one of those massive pieces of machinery that the Germans loved, something that looked like it belonged in a Jules Verne novel. It was tucked into a tunnel, coming out only to fire a shell the size of a trash can before disappearing back into the mountain. My job was to hang in the air, a tiny green speck in a white void, and wait for the puff of smoke that would give its position away. I was flying with the door open. I always flew with the door open back then, despite the cold. I needed to see, I needed to feel the air. If the engine coughed, I wanted to know it before the gauges did. I was hovering at about 3,000 feet, right on the edge of a stall, just trying to stay stationary in the headwind. That's when I saw the Storch. The Fiesler Storch was the German equivalent of my plane. It was a spindly, high-winged bird with long, gangly landing gear. It looked even more like a toy than mine did. We were 2 scouts, 2 observers, 2 sets of eyes for 2 massive armies, suddenly finding ourselves in the same patch of sky. In the matrix of the war, we weren't supposed to fight. We were the watchers. But there we were, maybe 200 yards apart, both of us startled. For a moment, neither of us did anything. We just flew, mirrored in our fragility. I could see the German pilot clearly. He was wearing a heavy sheepskin coat and a leather helmet. He looked at me, and I looked at him. I think in that moment, we both realized how ridiculous it all was. 2 men in motorized kites, suspended over a valley of death, each of us a single bullet away from oblivion. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I reached for my Colt, .45, the only weapon I had on me besides the radio. It felt heavy and clumsy in my gloved hand. I didn't want to shoot him. I didn't even know if I could hit anything from a bouncing cockpit while flying a plane. But the training kicks in, that mechanical part of your brain that the system installs during basic training. You don't think, you execute. I banked the L4, trying to get on his tail, and he did the same. It was the slowest dogfight in the history of aviation. We were doing maybe 60 miles an hour, circling each other like 2 tired vultures. I fired a few shots, the reports of the pistols sounding tiny and insignificant against the roar of the engine. The German pilot didn't fire back. He didn't have a gun, or maybe he just didn't want to play. He suddenly dove, heading for the safety of a flak-protected ridge. I watched him go, and I put the pistol back in the holster. My heart was racing, not with the thrill of the hunt, but with a sudden, overwhelming sense of shame. I had tried to kill a man who was just like me, for no other reason than the color of the paint on his wings. I never did find that railgun that day. The clouds moved back in, and I had to navigate home by memory and luck, following the line of a frozen river until I saw the smoke from our camp. When I landed, I didn't tell anyone about the Storch. It felt like a private failure. It felt like I'd almost let the machine win. We spend so much time being told who our enemies are, but out there, in the silence of the clouds, it's hard to find an enemy. You just find other people caught in the same storm. I've carried that German pilot with me for 80 years. I wonder if he made it. I wonder if he's sitting in a chair in Munich or Berlin right now, thinking about the American in the green kite who shot at him with a pistol. I hope he is. I hope we both outlive the madness that tried to make us killers. The war began to feel like a factory toward the end. Everything was about tonnage, about numbers, about the cold mathematics of attrition. How many shells? How many gallons? How many casualties? It was a system designed to strip away the individual and replace him with a statistic. But the grasshopper was an anti-statistical machine. It was too small to be a number. It was too personal. Every patch on the wing was a story. Every rattle in the instrument panel was a memory. I think that's why the infantry boys eventually stopped mocking me. They realized that I was the only thing in the sky that was as vulnerable as they were. The heavy bombers were distant gods, but I was right there in the dirt with them. I was the guy who could see the individual sniper in the hayloft or the hidden MG-42 in the basement. I wasn't just a pilot, I was their witness. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember a night in the Rhine Valley. We were pushing hard, and the Germans were throwing everything they had left at us. They were using screaming Mimis, the Nebelwerfer rockets, and the sound was enough to drive a man insane. It was a high-pitched metallic wail that felt like it was tearing the air apart. I was grounded that night, huddled in a cellar with a group of guys from the 82nd. There was one kid, a replacement who'd been with us for maybe 3 days. He was shaking so hard he couldn't hold his canteen. He kept asking me if the planes were coming. He thought the Air Force could just turn off the war like a light switch. I didn't have the heart to tell him that the Air Force couldn't even see us in this weather. I just told him to keep his head down and listen to the old-timers. I stayed awake all night, watching him, wondering how many more of these kids the machine was going to consume before it was satisfied. When the sun finally came up, the ground was littered with the spent casings of the rockets. The landscape looked like the moon. I walked out to my plane, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to fly. I felt a profound weariness, a weight in my chest that no amount of altitude could cure. But then Joe, the mechanic, came over. He had a piece of chocolate he'd saved from a Red Cross pack, and he handed it to me without a word. That little gesture, that tiny act of human kindness in the middle of a graveyard, it brought me back. It reminded me that the matrix of the war can take your sleep, it can take your friends, and it can take your youth, but it can't take your soul unless you let it. I ate that chocolate, I climbed into the cockpit, and I took off. I had work to do. I think that's the real reason I'm still talking at 92. People today, they're so worried about the system. They're worried about the economy, the politics, the technology. They feel like they're being crushed by forces they can't control. And they're right. The forces are huge. But I'm living proof that a toy plane can stand up to a Panther tank. I'm proof that a single person doing something they weren't supposed to do in a way they weren't supposed to do it can change the map. You don't need a heavy bomber to make a difference. You just need to find your bazookas and strap them to your wings. You need to be willing to dive when everyone else is telling you to stay at a safe altitude. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. There was a moment just before the surrender when I was flying over a liberated camp. I didn't know what it was at the time. I just saw people in striped pajamas standing behind a wire fence. I flew low, so low I could see their faces. They weren't cheering. They weren't waving. They were just standing there, like statues made of ash. I remember looking down and feeling a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter. That was the moment I realized what we were really fighting for. It wasn't about borders or ideologies or the greatest generation. It was about stopping the ultimate machine, the one that had decided that human beings were just industrial waste. I circled that camp 3 times. I wanted them to see the American flag on my wing. I wanted them to know that the sky didn't belong to the monsters anymore. When I landed back at the base, I went behind the hangar and I cried. I'm not ashamed of that. A man who sees that and doesn't cry is a man who's already dead. I cried for the people in the pajamas. I cried for the German pilot in the storage. And I cried for the kid with the canteen who didn't make it through the night. I realized then that the war would never really be over for me. It was going to be a part of my architecture, a structural beam in the house of my life. I'd spend the next 70 years trying to build something beautiful on top of that grief, but the grief would always be the foundation. Now, I look at the world through the eyes of a 92-year-old man, and I see a lot of people who are lost. They're searching for meaning in all the wrong places. They think the matrix is something they can escape through a screen or a purchase. But meaning isn't something you find, it's something you build. It's the bazookas on the wing. It's the decision to save the refugees when you're out of fuel. It's the willingness to be mocked by the men with the big guns because you know your toy has a purpose they can't understand. I don't have many flights left. My wings are tired and the engine is running on fumes. But I'm happy. I'm happy because I told the truth. I'm happy because I remembered the names. And I'm happy because I know that somewhere out there, there's a young person listening to this who's realizing that they don't have to be a cog. They don't have to follow the manual. They can take their toy plane and they can change the world. They just have to be brave enough to take off. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember my last flight in the L4. It was in June of '45. The war in Europe was over and they were preparing to ship us home or to the Pacific. I took the plane up one last time, alone. I didn't have a mission. I didn't have a radio. I just flew. I flew over the fields where the tanks had burned. The grass was already starting to grow back, a vibrant, stubborn green that was covering the scars of the treads. Nature has a way of erasing our madness, of reclaiming the ground we try to steal. I looked down at the empty bazooka mounts on my struts, and I felt a strange sense of peace. The toy was going back to being a toy. The weapons were gone. I was just a man in a kite again, watching the world go by. I've lived a long time, and I've seen a lot of things change. I've seen the world get faster, louder, and more complicated. But the basic truths remain. The things that haunted me at 19 are the same things that sustain me at 92. The importance of a handshake, the value of a shared cigarette, the necessity of standing up when everyone else is sitting down. I'm Henry Lawson, and I'm just a witness, but I hope my testimony means something to you. I hope it reminds you that the system is only as strong as your willingness to believe in it. And I hope you never stop flying your toy plane, no matter how many bazookas they throw at you. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten.